Hey guys, let's talk about some of the basic tips and tricks you need for working with an image for the first time for new users in Adobe Photoshop. So let's pop up the screen and take it away. All right, so I've got an image open inside Photoshop and I'd like to be able to perform some basic functions and work with the image in the proper way. So I want to cover some of the fundamentals, explain that so you know what you're dealing with. First things first, we want to make sure that we keep things in the right color mode, or at least that we're using the color mode we intend for the long term with this image. So what does that mean? That means that when we're inside Photoshop, if we go to image mode, you're going to see there the color mode that's applied to the image. Now, definitely if you've taken this picture in a digital camera or got it from some other source, it's going to be there as RGB. And that's what you want to leave it as, especially when working with photography and digital art. I think a good rule of thumb is to work in RGB until the very end. There's a process to convert your image to CMYK when necessary for printing. But for all of the effects and different things you're going to want to be able to do in Photoshop, I think it's better to stick with RGB. Another thing to mention about those color settings is to also look at the color profile of your image. And so under the Edit menu, you're going to find color settings. I don't want to dive in too deep here because this could be a lesson in and unto itself. But essentially, Adobe Photoshop and other Adobe software is set up to work in what are called color spaces. This includes the RGB color space, the CMYK color space, grayscale, spot color, and so on. And by default, you should be okay leaving your images in the defaults, with one exception. If you look at the RGB working space, I always think it's a good idea to switch over to Adobe RGB 1998. Now, you can see in my long list, there are a bazillion other choices. You can pretty much ignore those, only worry about those if you're working in a closed system with specific printer drivers and other things like that. For us, we just want Adobe to do a predictable thing, work with color in the same way. And so what you want to do is make sure that your color setting is on Adobe RGB 1998. That is a good uniform color setting that will apply to all of your images and make sure that they're working in that proper color space. The other thing to look at is, it says here, color management policies. We want to make sure that basically Photoshop by default is leaving these things alone. That means your source image comes in with its own color space, color profile, and you can leave that alone. It's not something you really have to mess with. That's more of an advanced thing to worry about. So as long as those say preserve embedded, you're good to go. All this other stuff, all this technical stuff, better just leave it alone at this point and move from there. All right, let's go back to looking at some of the image settings for our image. Image, and then let's look at image size. Now this is where we need to look at the actual properties of our image. And we need to keep in mind a few rules of thumb. First, it's best to make your image the highest resolution reasonable. So what does that mean? That means that when you're taking photographs with your digital camera, you want to make sure that you use it on the high setting so that the quality of images that you get are high. Also, you don't want to be working with web images, downloaded images from the web. That would be images found on Google Image Search or something like that. You want to avoid those, especially for professional work, for a variety of reasons. But the image quality is always low. That means the resolution is awful for printing, and many times the resolution isn't even very good for web or for the screen. So make sure that your image size is good. And by default, that's going to mean that your resolution should be somewhere around 300 dpi, and your inches should be of reasonable size, or at least actual size. Now, this is something you're going to run into when working with digital photography. Digital photos are set to 72 dpi, and the way they increase the quality of those images is they increase the pixel dimension. So that means that this image says that it's 56 inches by 42 inches wide. That's huge. You know, that's almost 4 feet wide by 4 feet tall at 72 dpi. Now we know that 72 pixels per inch is screen resolution, but it's not print resolution. Print resolution is 300 ppi, pixels per inch. Now watch what happens if I make a change. I'm going to uncheck this little box that says resample. And then I'm going to just manually type in 300 to the resolution setting on this image. And look at how that picture changed. 300 now converted that image to actually 14 inches by 10 inches, which means that my camera took this picture at print resolution, and actual dimension, actual size, is about 14 inches by 10 inches, about 11 by 14 inches. That's a pretty decent sized image. And if I'm going to be using this for print, using it for art purposes, I need to make sure that my images are in that range. So pay attention to that. If you're only looking at pixel dimensions, you definitely need your images to be up in the 4,000, 3,000 range in dimension. That will be a high print resolution. So pay attention to that as well on your camera settings. But here inside Photoshop, you can convert all of these things and change them. Sometimes you can downsize something, you can shrink it. Like I could make this image 2 inches by 3 inches, for example. Totally fine. But what you can't do is go the other direction. If you start with an image that's like 2 inches by 3 inches and you try to blow it up to 20 inches wide, it's gonna blow it out and look horrible. So you want to avoid that as much as possible. All right, another thing to bring up. Let's talk about some of the basic image adjustments you can do right off the bat with your file. So under the image menu, there are a few automated features here. And sometimes I like to push people that direction, especially brand new users. If you're trying to autocorrect an image, Photoshop does a pretty good job of basically preserving your color, your value, and your shadows, and just doing an auto contrast or an auto color or an auto tone. For example, if I hit auto color on this, you may not have seen on the video, but it just adjusted it slightly. It basically tamped it down a little bit, harmonized the image colors. Another one I might try is auto contrast. Try that one. The change was pretty much imperceptible. Let's try auto tone, see what happens. Same thing. So basically that says that the color captured by the image, by the camera, was pretty balanced, and it didn't have to make a lot of auto adjustments. Something to notice, this image that I brought into Photoshop, I just altered it. I used that auto adjust feature and I just altered that image. Okay, that is what we call a permanent alteration. That's not something that can be edited or removed later. It's a permanent alteration. So you need to pay attention to your image and filing process in Photoshop. Not so important in InDesign or Illustrator. Those programs are designed to be editable. Photoshop, on the other hand, locks you in. So if you make a permanent alteration to your image, it's permanent. So there are a few habits that you need to establish as you start out in Photoshop. First is you need to get used to the idea of making copies of your images. Saving those files as copies and working on your copies. A good rule of thumb is that you keep one folder for originals. That would be images downloaded from your camera. Keep those and preserve those as best you can. And then whenever you're going to work and edit a photo, keep it in a separate folder and change its name and make it a copy. In other words, you're going to have two files. It's always a good idea to do that. That way, when you make alterations to the photo, you're not altering the original and you're not losing the original. This is a big deal in digital photography and digital imaging is what do you do with the originals and what happens if you lose them? Because you have to, once you destroy the image or once you alter it, it's done. You can't go back. Speaking about going back though, there is a little something called undo in Photoshop, Command Z or under the edit menu, the undo setting. The thing about Photoshop is it has a limited number of undos. And that's because undos take up a lot of RAM and they take up a lot of memory. So they limit you to just a few. And using Command Z only lets you go back like one step. That's one of those little annoying things about Photoshop. That being said, there is something called the history palette. We'll go into the history palette later, but I will mention it now that if you make a mistake, if you go to the window menu and you look for history, history keeps a running tally of all the changes you've made since you opened that file. And you can go back about 20 steps typically in the history palette. So keep that in mind. If you've made an alteration, you need to fix something, you can go back and select the original image where you started from. But again, best rule of thumb, save a copy, work on a copy of your file. Now let's talk about saving a file for a minute. If I go to the File menu and I do Save As, that's what I want to talk about for a minute. You can certainly do Save, and what's Save going to do? Save is going to save that file as the exact name that you opened it as, which is basically overwriting your original file. I like to get in the habit of doing a Save As. And this is going to force you to pay attention. By the way, here's a little advertisement for Cloud Documents. I'm going to skip it for now. Save on my computer. Okay, so basically what it's doing is when I do Save As, it gives me the opportunity to rename the file and change its location. So another rule of thumb, establish for yourself an edit images folder or a project by project folder. In other words, when you're working on a project, make a folder for that project and move all necessary files to that folder so you don't lose them. You keep track of them. A lot of people aren't very careful about where they save files and things get lost on their computers. Bad idea. It's better project by project, make a folder, make a working folder, something that you'll remember and you'll be able to find, and label and identify your files so you know where they're at. Then what I would typically do in a Photoshop scenario is I would go ahead and rename this file, like I'm going to call this, Venice Bridge, for example. And I'm not going to leave it as a JPEG file anymore because the kind of edits I'm going to apply to this image are going to be Photoshop edits, which means I need this to be a Photoshop file from now on so that it can accommodate layers and effects, adjustments, and all the other things that I could potentially apply to it. So I'm going to change that so that I now have a Venice Bridge Photoshop file. Now notice I did that by changing the format. Photoshop has a lot of potential image formats that you can use when setting up your files. So the main ones that you should pay attention to are Photoshop, which is the native file format. That's the best thing to do for your originals as you work on edits. Next one you want to worry about would be like JPEG. So you've got that available to you when it's time to flatten and share the file. Send it out as a digital image. Also, you've got PNG, especially for web and other scenarios. Good format to know. And the last one would be TIFF. And TIFF is important for print. If you need a full res bitmap image that is ready for print, accommodating CMYK or whatever color mode you're using, TIFF is your file. There are a few others on here, PDFs and others. There's even a little Pixar file format I've always noticed, which is fun, or GIF or one of those others. You can use those too, But again, the main image formats you're going to need to worry about: Photoshop, JPEG, PNG, and TIFF. Those are the ones you want to use. But again, because this is going to be my main editing file, Photoshop, PSD. And then I click Save, and away we go. It's now stored on my computer, and I know where it's at, and I won't lose it. So those are a few of the important things to pay attention to as you're opening a file, working with a file, and saving it, knowing where it's at when you're done with it. Of course, we'll have lots more to talk about when we get into other lessons later on, but want to make sure that you follow those rules as you set up and take care of your files to make sure that you don't lose them. All right, see you next time.